In the United Kingdom, independent schools are fee-paying private schools, governed by an elected board of governors and independent of many of the regulations and conditions that apply to state-funded schools. Some of the older, expensive and more exclusive schools catering for the 13 to 18 age range in England and Wales are known as public schools, the term public being derived from the fact that they were open to pupils regardless of where they lived or their religion. Prep schools educate younger children up to the age of 13 to prepare them for entry to the public schools and other independent schools. Some former grammar schools converted to an independent fee-paying model following the 1965 Circular 1065, which marked the end of their state funding. Others converted into comprehensive schools. There are around 2,500 independent schools in the UK, which educate around 615,000 children. Some 7% of all British children and 18% of pupils over the age of 16. In addition to charging tuition fees, many also benefit from gifts, charitable endowments and charitable status. Many of these schools are members of the Independent Schools Council. History. Origins. Some independent schools are particularly old, such as the King's School, Canterbury, St. Peter's School, York, Sherborne School, Warwick School, the King's School, Ely and St. Albans School. These schools were founded as part of the Church and were under their complete dominion. However, it was during the late 14th and early 15th centuries that the first schools, independent of the Church, were founded. Winchester and Oswestry were the first of their kind and paved the way for the establishment of the modern public school. These were often established for male scholars from poor or disadvantaged backgrounds. However, English law has always regarded education as a charitable end in itself, irrespective of poverty. For instance, the Queen's Scholarships founded at Westminster in 1560, are for the sons of decayed gentlemen. The transformation of free charitable foundations into institutions which sometimes charge fees came about readily. The foundation would only afford minimal facilities, so that further fees might be charged to lodge, clothe and otherwise maintain the scholars, to the private profit of the trustees or headmaster. Also, facilities already provided by the charitable foundation for a few scholars could profitably be extended to further paying pupils. After a time, such fees would eclipse the original charitable income, and the original endowment would naturally become a minor part of the capital benefactions enjoyed by the school. In 2009, senior boarding schools were charging fees of between £16,000 and nearly £30,000 per annum. However, majority of the independent schools today are still registered as a charity. Bursary is available to students on means test. Basic. Christ's Hospital in Horsham is one of the examples. Large proportion of its students are funded by its charitable foundation or by various benefactors. Victorian expansion. The educational reforms of the 19th century were particularly important under first Thomas Arnold at Rugby, and then Butler and later Kennedy at Shrewsbury, the former emphasizing team spirit and muscular Christianity and the latter the importance of scholarship and competitive examinations. Edward Thring of Uppingham School introduced major reforms, focusing on the importance of the individual and competition, as well as the need for a total curriculum, with academia, music, sport and drama being central to education. Most public schools developed significantly during the 18th and 19th centuries, and came to play an important role in the development of the Victorian social elite. Under a number of forward-looking headmasters, leading public schools created a curriculum based heavily on classics and physical activity for boys and young men of the upper and upper middle classes. They were schools for the gentlemanly elite of Victorian politics, armed forces and colonial government. Often successful businessmen would send their sons to a public school as a mark of participation in the elite. Much of the discipline was in the hands of senior pupils, which was not just a means to reduce staffing costs, but was also seen as vital preparation for those pupils' later roles in public or military service. More recently, heads of public schools have been emphasizing that senior pupils now play a much reduced role in disciplining. To an extent, the public school system influenced the school systems of the British Empire. Unrecognizably, public schools can be found in many Commonwealth countries. Modern era. Until 1975, there had been a group of 179 academically selective schools drawing on both private and state funding. The direct grant grammar schools. The Direct Grant Grammar Schools Regulations 1975 required these schools to choose between full state funding as comprehensive schools and full independence. As a result, 119 of these schools became independent. Pupil numbers at independent schools fell slightly during the mid-1970s recession. At the same time, participation at all secondary schools grew dramatically, so that the share of the independent sector fell from a little under 8% in 1964 to reach a low of 5.7% in 1978. Both these trends were reversed during the 1980s, and the share of the independent schools reached 7.5% by 1991. The changes since 1990 have been less dramatic, participation falling to 6.9% by 1996 before increasing very slightly after 2000 to reach 7.2% in 2012. In 2015, the figure has fallen back to 6.9%, with the absolute number of pupils attending independent schools falling everywhere in England apart from in the southeast. The present day. England and Wales. In 2011, there were more than 2,600 independent schools in the UK, educating some 628,000 children, comprising over 6.5% of UK children, and more than 18% of pupils over the age of 16. In England, the schools account for a slightly higher percentage than in the UK as a whole. According to a 2010 study by Ryan and Sibisha, the proportion of pupils attending independent schools in England is currently 7.2%. Most of the larger independent schools are either full or partial boarding schools, although many are now predominantly day schools. By contrast, there are only a few dozen state boarding schools. Boarding school traditions give a distinctive character to British independent education, even in the case of day pupils. Most independent schools, particularly the larger and older institutions, have charitable status. The Independent Schools Council say that UK independent schools receive approximately £100 million tax relief due to charitable status, whilst returning £300 million of fee assistance in public benefit and relieving the maintained sector of £2 billion of costs. Inspections in England. The Independent Schools Council, through 7 affiliated organisations, represents 1,289 schools that together educate over 80% of the pupils in the UK independent sector. Those schools in England which are members of the affiliated organisations of the ISC are inspected by the Independent Schools Inspectorate under a framework agreed between ISC, the government's Department for Education, and the Office for Standards in Education. Independent schools not affiliated to the ISC in England may be inspected by either School Inspection Service or Bridge Schools Trust. Independent schools accredited to the ISC in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland or others in England out with the inspectorial bodies listed above are inspected through the national inspectorates in each country. Scotland. Independent schools in Scotland educate about 31,000 children and often referred to as private schools. Although many of the Scottish independent schools are members of the ISC, they are also represented by the Scottish Council of Independent Schools, recognised by the Scottish Parliament as the body representing private schools in Scotland. Unlike England, all Scottish independent schools are subject to the same regime of inspections by Education Scotland as local authority schools, and they have to register with the Learning Directorate. The 9 largest Scottish independent schools, with 1,000 or more pupils, are George Watson's College, Hodgson's Grammar School, Robert Gordon's College, George Heriot's School, St Aloysius College, the Glasgow Academy, Dollar Academy, the High School of Glasgow and the High School of Dundee. Historically, in Scotland, it was common for children destined for private schools to receive their primary education at a local school. This arose because of Scotland's long tradition of state-funded education, which was spearheaded by the Church of Scotland from the 17th century, long before such education was common in England. Independent prep schools only became more widespread in Scotland from the late 19th century. Though they are still much less prevalent than in England, they are, however, currently gaining in numbers. Selection independent schools, like state grammar schools, are free to select their pupils, subject to general legislation against discrimination. The principal forms of selection are financial, in that the pupil's family must be able to pay the school fees, and academic, with many administering their own entrance exams. Some also require that the prospective student undergo an interview, and credit may also be given for musical, sporting or other talent. Entrance to some schools is more or less restricted to pupils whose parents practice a particular religion, or schools may require all pupils to attend religious services. Nowadays most schools pay little regard to family connections, apart from siblings currently at the school. Only a small minority of parents can afford school fees averaging over £23,000 per annum for boarding pupils and £11,000 for day pupils, with additional costs for uniform, equipment and extracurricular facilities. Scholarships and means-tested bursaries to assist the education of the less well-off are usually awarded by a process which combines academic and other criteria. Independent schools are generally academically selective, using the competitive common entrance examination at ages 11 to 13. Schools often offer scholarships to attract abler pupils. The standard sometimes approaches the General Certificate of Secondary Education intended for age 16. Poorly performing pupils may be required to leave, and following GCSE results can be replaced in the sixth form by a new infusion of high-performing sixth form-only pupils, which may distort apparent results. Conditions: independent schools, as compared with maintained schools, are generally characterized by more individual teaching, much better pupil-teacher ratios at around 9:1, longer teaching hours and homework, though shorter terms, more time for organized sports and extracurricular activities, more emphasis on traditional academic subjects such as maths, classics and modern languages, and a broader education than that prescribed by the national curriculum, to which state school education is in practice limited. As boarding schools are fully responsible for their pupils throughout term time, pastoral care is an essential part of independent education, and many independent schools teach their own distinctive ethos, including social aspirations, manners and accents associated with their own school traditions. Many pupils aspire to send their own children to their old schools in their historical buildings, over successive generations. Most offer sporting, musical, dramatic and art facilities, sometimes at extra charges, although often with the benefit of generations of past investment. Educational achievement is generally very good. Independent school pupils are 4 times more likely to attain an A* at GCSE than their non-selective state sector counterparts, and twice as likely to attain an A grade at A-level. A much higher proportion go to university. Some schools specialize in particular strengths, whether academic, vocational or artistic, although this is not as common as it is in the state sector. Independent schools are able to set their own discipline regime, with much greater freedom to exclude children, primarily exercised in the wider interests of the school. The most usual causes being drug taking, whether at school or away, or an open rejection of the school's values, such as dishonesty or violence. In England and Wales there are no requirements for teaching staff to have qualified teacher status or to be registered with the General Teaching Council. In Scotland, a teaching qualification and registration with the General Teaching Council for Scotland is mandatory for all teaching positions. Impact on the British economy. In 2014, the Independent Schools Council commissioned a report to highlight the impact that independent schools have on the British economy. The report calculated that independent schools support an £11.7 billion contribution to gross value added in Britain. This figure is arrived at by summing the saving to the taxpayer by not having to provide school places to 620,000 pupils. The value of the jobs created by the independent schools, the tax revenue created, directly and indirectly, by the independent sector, and the economic contribution of their alumni. This greatly exaggerates the value added to the economy, as many of the benefits would still accrue if the state funded their education, jobs would still be created, tax revenues paid, and the alumni, being of above-average ability with high levels of parental backing, would still do well and contribute greatly to the economy. The failure of the Oxford Economics report to discuss this when supposedly calculating the value added by the independent sector raises concerns about the report's integrity.